The red sun bled across the jagged peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, painting the New Mexico sky in shades of violence. Taza Redhawk pressed his palm against the wound in his side, feeling the warm wetness seep through his fingers. Each breath came harder than the last, rattling in his chest like dry bones in a medicine bag. 3 days. 3 days since the ambush at Coyote Creek, where blue-coated soldiers had torn through his band like wildfire through sage. The faces of his fallen brothers haunted him, Running Bear with his throat open to the sky, White Eagle's eyes staring sightlessly at the circling vultures. They had trusted the government's promise of safe passage. They had been fools. The rocky outcropping he'd crawled beneath offered little shelter from the desert wind, but it would serve as well as any place for a warrior's final rest. His horse had collapsed miles back, its great heart finally giving out after carrying him beyond the reach of pursuit. Taza had whispered the old words of gratitude before closing the animal's eyes, knowing his own would soon follow. The wound had gone bad. He could smell it now, the sweet, sick scent of flesh beginning to rot. His grandmother would have known which plants to gather, which prayers to speak. But she was ash on the wind now, along with everyone else who might have mourned his passing. Through fever-glazed eyes, he watched the shadows lengthen across the canyon floor. Soon the coyotes would come, then the buzzards. His bones would bleach white under the endless sky, unmarked and unmourned. Perhaps it was fitting. He had failed his people, failed to protect them from the endless hunger of the white man's expansion. The sound of water reached him through his delirium, impossible in this parched land, yet unmistakable. A stream, close by. His tongue, swollen and cracked, moved reflexively against the roof of his mouth. Death could wait a few moments more. Using his rifle as a crutch, Taza dragged himself toward the sound. Each movement sent lightning through his body, but Apache boys learned early that pain was merely another test of will. The stream appeared like a vision from the spirit world, a thin ribbon of silver winding between smooth stones, fed by some hidden spring in the mountainside. He collapsed at its edge, drinking deeply despite the agony it caused his parched throat. The water was cold, sweet, real. For a moment, the fever's grip loosened enough for him to see clearly. That's when he saw her. Hannah Whitmore had come to the stream to fill her water buckets, as she had every morning for the past 3 years. The routine was one of the few things that still anchored her to the world of the living. Walk to the stream, fill the buckets, tend the garden, feed the chickens, sleep, wake, repeat. A widow's litany, performed without thought or feeling. She saw the blood first, a dark trail leading from the rocks to where the man lay half submerged at the water's edge. Her buckets clattered to the ground, water forgotten. He was Apache. She knew it from the length of his hair, the cut of what remained of his clothing, the copper tone of his skin. Her hand moved instinctively to the pistol at her waist. Thomas had insisted she always carry it when alone, but Thomas was 2 years in the ground, hanged for a treason he never committed, and this man was clearly dying. She approached cautiously, weapon drawn but not aimed. His eyes opened as her shadow fell across him, eyes black as obsidian, burning with fever and something else. Defiance, perhaps, or simple acceptance of whatever death she might bring. "Don't move," she said, though it was clear he lacked the strength to threaten a newborn calf. He said something in his own tongue, words she couldn't understand but recognized as prayer. His hand moved slightly, not toward any weapon but to press against the ugly wound in his side. Hannah had seen enough hurt animals to recognize the choice before her. She could walk away, let nature take its course. It would be the prudent thing, the safe thing. No one would fault a widow for leaving a savage to die, but she kept seeing Thomas in her mind, not as he'd been at the end, purple-faced and twisting at the rope's end while the crowd jeered, but as he'd been when wounded at Chancellorsville, how he'd looked at her with just that same mixture of pain and resignation when the field surgeon said his leg would have to come off, how she'd fought for him then, demanded better care, refused to let him slip away. She'd failed him in the end. failed to save him from false accusation, from the mob's justice, from the system that had ground him down and spit him out. "Can you stand?" she asked the Apache. His brow furrowed, whether from pain or lack of understanding, she couldn't tell. She gestured, miming the action. He shook his head slightly. Hannah looked back toward her cabin, barely visible through the cottonwoods. It wasn't far, but it might as well have been 1,000 miles for a man in his condition. She thought of her neighbors, what they would say if they knew. Thought of the consequences. Then she thought of the empty bed she'd slept in for 2 years, the silence that pressed against her eardrums each night, the weight of survival without purpose. "Wait here," she said, knowing he had no choice in the matter. She returned with her mule and the travois she used for hauling firewood. The Apache watched her preparations with those dark eyes, saying nothing when she awkwardly maneuvered him onto the canvas. He bit down on his own hand to keep from crying out, and she pretended not to notice the tears that leaked from the corners of his eyes. The journey back seemed endless. Every bump and jostle drew a harsh breath from her passenger, though he made no other sound. By the time she reached the cabin, his eyes had rolled back, showing only whites. Still breathing, though still fighting. She'd dragged Thomas home like this once, after a tavern brawl in the early days of their marriage. He'd woken the next morning sheepish and apologetic, swearing off whiskey and meaning it. They'd laughed about it later, how she'd cursed him the whole way, threatening to leave him in the street for the dogs. There was no laughter now, only the harsh rasp of labored breathing and the whisper of her skirts against the floor as she worked. She cut away what remained of his shirt, sucking in a breath at the damage revealed. The wound was deep, ragged, likely from a cavalry saber rather than a bullet. Infection had already set in, angry red streaks radiating outward like poisonous vines. She'd helped Thomas tend enough injured men during the war to know what needed doing. Boiled water, clean cloth, the bottle of whiskey hidden beneath the loose floorboard, the knife heated red-hot in the fire. The Apache came awake when she poured the whiskey over the wound, his body arching off the bed. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. For a moment they stared at each other, predator and prey, though she couldn't say which was which. "I'm trying to help," she said softly, as she might to a wounded wolf. "Please." Something in her tone, or perhaps simple exhaustion, made him release her. He turned his face away, presenting his profile like a man awaiting execution. She worked quickly, cutting away the dead flesh, packing the wound with clean cloth soaked in whiskey. Her hands remained steady even as her mind reeled at what she was doing. Harboring an enemy. That's what they'd call it. That's what they'd hang Thomas for, though his only crime had been speaking against the war after Gettysburg broke him. When she finished, the Apache had passed out again. His breathing seemed easier, though his skin still burned with fever. She pulled a chair beside the bed, wringing cool water from a cloth to place on his forehead. The sun had set without her noticing, leaving the cabin in shadows broken only by the fire's glow. She should eat something, should tend to the animals, should do any number of things that didn't involve sitting beside a dying Apache warrior who might well kill her if he recovered. Instead, she found herself studying his face in the firelight, younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 summers, though the hard life of his people made it difficult to tell. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, pale against his darker skin. His hands, resting atop the blanket, were calloused from weapons and work, but gracefully formed. Beautiful, in the way a mountain cat was beautiful. Dangerous and wild and utterly out of place in her small, tame world. What was she doing? The question echoed in the silence, unanswered and unanswerable. She only knew that for the first time in 2 years, she felt something other than the numbing weight of grief. Even if it was only fear and uncertainty, it was something. The Apache stirred, muttering in his own language. She dipped the cloth again, cooling his fever as she'd once cooled Thomas's, as she would do through the long night ahead. And whatever came after, outside, coyotes howled at the rising moon. their calls echoing off the canyon walls like the voices of the dead. But inside the small cabin, two hearts continued their stubborn beating. One Apache, one white, both wounded beyond easy healing. For now, that was enough. The Apache had been conscious for 3 days now, though he might as well have been a statue for all the interaction he offered. He watched her with those dark eyes that missed nothing, following her movements as she prepared meals, tended his wound, went about her daily chores. But he spoke no word, made no gesture beyond the bare minimum required for survival. Hannah had grown accustomed to silence in her widowhood. But this was different. This was a living presence that filled the cabin with unspoken questions and careful observation. She found herself talking to fill the void, though she suspected he understood little of her words. "The chickens are laying well this week," she said one morning, setting a plate of eggs and cornbread beside his bed. "Course, that old red hen's gotten broody again. Sits on her nest like she's guarding gold, pecking at anyone who comes near." His eyes tracked from the plate to her face, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. But he ate what she brought, slowly and carefully, as if each bite required consideration. "My husband Thomas used to say that Hen had more fight in her than most men he knew." The words came unbidden, surprising her. She rarely spoke of Thomas anymore. What was the point? But something about this silent audience loosened her tongue. He was right about that. At least, that hen's outlasted him by 2 years now. The Apache's gaze sharpened at the mention of Thomas, a slight furrow appearing between his brows. He'd noticed, then, the absence of a man about the place. The realization should have frightened her, a lone woman with a strange warrior under her roof. Instead, she felt only a weary sort of acceptance. By the 5th day, he was sitting up, though the effort clearly cost him. She caught him examining his wound when he thought she wasn't looking, his face giving nothing away as he assessed the damage. The infection had retreated, leaving angry but healing flesh. He would carry the scar for the rest of his days, however many those might be. She'd moved his weapons to the barn, the rifle, the knife, the war club he'd somehow retained through his flight. He'd watched her do it without protest, though his jaw had tightened when she'd handled the items. Sacred things, perhaps. She'd been careful after that, wrapping them in clean cloth before storing them away. "You need to move more," she told him one afternoon, gesturing at his legs. "The muscles will weaken if you don't use them." He stared at her blankly, though she suspected he understood more than he let on. She demonstrated, walking slowly across the room, then pointed at him. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, with infinite care, he swung his legs over the side of the bed. The blanket fell away, revealing the lean, scarred body of a man who'd lived by violence. She should have looked away. Propriety demanded it. But this was no parlor game of manners. This was survival. His and perhaps hers. He stood slowly, one hand braced against the wall. Sweat beaded on his forehead from the effort, but he remained upright. One step, then another. His legs trembled but held. "Good," she said softly. "That's good." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, at the approval in her voice. He made it to the window before his strength gave out, sinking onto the bench she'd placed there. But he didn't return to the bed. Instead, he sat looking out at the desert landscape, his profile sharp against the afternoon light. Hannah returned to her mending, stealing glances at him over her needlework. There was something almost peaceful about his stillness, the way he could sit for hours without fidgeting or complaint. Thomas had been a pacer, wearing tracks in their floor with his restless energy. This man was like the mountains themselves, patient, enduring, carved by time and hardship into something elemental. That night, she woke to find him standing over her bed, her heart hammered against her ribs as she lay frozen, acutely aware of her vulnerability. The pistol was in the kitchen drawer, too far to reach. Moonlight silvered his face, making him look like something from the spirit world her Mexican neighbors whispered about. But he made no threatening move. Instead, he placed something on her nightstand, a small object that caught the moonlight. Then he returned to his own bed, moving silent as smoke through the darkness. She waited until his breathing deepened before reaching for the object. It was a piece of turquoise, no bigger than her thumbnail, carved into the shape of a bird. The work was delicate, precise, speaking of hours of patient labor, a gift, or perhaps a payment. The next morning she found him in the kitchen, attempting to rekindle the fire in the stove. He looked up when she entered, something almost like embarrassment crossing his features before the mask of stoicism returned. "Let me," she said, moving to help. Their hands brushed as she took the kindling from him, and he jerked back as if burned. But from that day forward, he began to help where he could. Small things at first, bringing in wood from the pile, feeding the chickens when she was busy with other tasks. He moved carefully, still healing, but with a determination that spoke of pride too strong to accept charity without reciprocation. She continued to talk as she worked, filling the silence with stories of her life. How she'd met Thomas at a church social in Missouri. How they'd come west full of dreams about fresh starts and fortune. How those dreams had curdled into something bitter when the war followed them even here. He wasn't a traitor, she said one evening, kneading bread with perhaps more force than necessary. He just couldn't stomach any more killing after what he saw in the war. Said both sides had lost their minds, that nothing was worth that much blood. But that kind of talk doesn't sit well when neighbors have sons dying in uniform. The Apache watched her from his place by the fire, whittling something from a piece of pine she'd given him. His hands moved with practiced ease, shaping the wood into something she couldn't yet identify. They came for him at night, dozen men with torches and righteous fury. Said he'd been passing information to Confederate sympathizers, though God knows what information a failed farmer could have that would matter to anyone. Her voice caught. Remembering. I begged them to wait for a proper trial, told them they were wrong. But mob justice doesn't listen to women's pleas. The whittling had stopped. When she looked up, the Apache was watching her with something that might have been understanding in his dark eyes. He'd lost his own people to violence. After all, he knew the weight of grief. That night, she cried in the kitchen, muffling her sobs in a dish towel so as not to disturb her guest. She hadn't wept for Thomas in months, had thought herself wrung dry of tears, but speaking of him had opened old wounds, made fresh the pain she'd buried under routine and necessity. She didn't hear the Apache approach, didn't know he was there until she felt the lightest touch on her shoulder. When she looked up, he was holding out the piece of wood he'd been carving. It was a woman's figure, simple but graceful, head bowed as if in sorrow or prayer. Their eyes met across the gulf of language and culture, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, two souls marked by loss, finding themselves in this unlikely sanctuary. He returned to his bed without a word, leaving her holding the wooden figure. She sat there long into the night, turning it over in her hands, feeling the smooth planes he'd carved with such patience. When she finally slept, she dreamed not of Thomas at the rope's end, but of dark eyes that saw too much, and gentle hands shaping beauty from raw wood. She woke ashamed of such dreams, but could not deny their sweetness. The Apache continued to heal, continued to help, continued to watch her with that steady gaze that seemed to see through to her very bones. And Hannah continued to talk, to share her small life with this strange, silent man who'd stumbled into her world trailing blood and sorrow. Neither spoke of what would happen when he was well enough to leave. That future loomed unspoken between them, a question neither seemed ready to answer. For now, there was only the routine of daily survival, the careful dance of two wounded creatures learning to share the same space. But sometimes, in the evening when the light slanted golden through the windows and the desert wind sang its lonesome song, Hannah caught herself thinking dangerous thoughts about what it might mean to not be alone, about the warmth of another presence in her cold bed, about the way his rare almost smiles transformed his harsh features into something almost beautiful. Foolish thoughts for a foolish woman, she told herself, but in the high desert silence, with only the wind and the coyotes for company, Foolishness seemed a small price to pay for the fragile hope beginning to unfurl in her chest like the first green shoots after a killing frost. The morning sun painted the desert in shades of gold and copper when Hannah found the Apache examining Thomas's old bow. She'd forgotten it was there, gathering dust in the corner of the barn beside the farming tools her husband had abandoned for dreams of easier fortune. That was his, she said quietly from the doorway. Thomas fancied himself something of a marksman before. She trailed off, watching the way the warrior's hands moved over the weapon with professional interest. He looked up at her, then down at the bow, his expression asking a question words couldn't convey. Permission, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement of the trespass. "Take it," she said, surprising herself. "It's doing no good collecting spider webs." He lifted the bow, testing its weight and draw. His movements were fluid, practiced. Speaking of years of training, her husband's Sunday afternoon hobby could never have matched, finding it acceptable. He nodded once, the closest thing to thanks she'd received. That afternoon, she watched from the kitchen window as he crafted arrows from river willow and turkey feathers she'd saved from last autumn's hunt. His hands worked with meditative precision, each movement deliberate and sure. When he finished, he had a dozen arrows, crude by his standards perhaps, but functional. "Show me," she said when he returned to the cabin, gesturing at the bow. His eyebrows rose slightly, the most expression she'd seen from him yet. But he picked up the weapon and stepped back outside, she following with a curiosity she couldn't quite explain. He nocked an arrow and drew in one smooth motion. Holding for a heartbeat before releasing, the arrow flew true, embedding itself in the fence post 40 yards distant. A second followed, then a third, each landing within a finger's width of the first. Lord above, Hannah breathed. Thomas could barely hit the broadside of the barn from half that distance. Something that might have been amusement flickered across the Apache's features. He held out the bow to her, gesturing for her to try. "Oh, no," she said, backing away. "I wouldn't know the first thing about—" But he was already moving behind her, placing the bow in her hands, adjusting her grip with touches light as butterfly wings. She was acutely aware of his presence, the warmth of him at her back, the scent of sage and wood smoke that clung to his skin. His hands covered hers on the bow, guiding her to draw the string. The position was improper, scandalous even, but there was nothing improper in his touch, only the careful instruction of teacher to student. "Like this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He made a sound of approval, then stepped away, leaving her to hold the draw on her own. Her arms trembled with the effort, the string cutting into her fingers. She released too quickly, the arrow sailing over the fence post to disappear into the sagebrush beyond. To her amazement, a sound came from the Apache, low and rusty, but unmistakably laughter. She turned to find him smiling, truly smiling, the expression transforming his face entirely. He looked younger, almost boyish, the harsh lines of suffering temporarily erased. "You think that's funny?" she asked. But she was smiling too, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Let's see you milk a cow, then we'll see who's laughing." The lesson continued, his patience seemingly endless as he corrected her stance, her draw, her release. By the end, she could hit the fence post 1 time in 3, which he seemed to find acceptable for a beginning. That evening, as she prepared supper, he spoke for the first time. "Taza," he said, touching his chest. His voice was deep, roughened by disuse, carrying the musical cadence of his native tongue even in that single word. "Taza," she repeated, testing the sound. Then, touching her own chest, "Hannah," he nodded, repeating her name with careful pronunciation. Such a simple exchange, but it changed everything. He was no longer just the Apache, the wounded stranger in her home. He was Taza, a man with a name and, presumably, a history beyond the violence that had brought him to her door. The days that followed took on a different quality. They developed a routine of sorts, morning chores done together in companionable silence. Afternoon lessons with the bow. She was improving, though he still found her efforts amusing. Evenings by the fire where sometimes he would speak a word or two in his language, teaching her as she had taught him. But the peace was fragile, and they both knew it. The first sign of trouble came when she went to town for supplies. The general store fell silent when she entered, conversation stopping mid-sentence. Mrs. Garrett, who usually gossiped about everyone and everything, served her with tight-lipped efficiency. "Heard you had some trouble out your way," Jim Morrison said as she loaded her wagon. He was the sheriff's deputy, a man who'd always been cordial if not warm. Now his eyes were sharp with suspicion. "Indian raid's been picking up again." "No trouble," Hannah said evenly. "Just the usual." "That's so." His gaze lingered on her purchases, the extra food, the medical supplies. "Because Tom Bradley swears he saw smoke from your place last week. More than just cook fire smoke. Tom Bradley sees Apache behind every rock and tree," she said. "Has since his brother got killed in '68. Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Maybe so. Still, a widow woman alone ought to be careful. Never know what kind of trouble might come calling." The weight of his stare followed her all the way home. She found Taza in the garden, pulling weeds with careful attention to which plants belonged and which didn't. He looked up at her approach, and she saw he understood something had changed. His hand moved unconsciously to his side, where his knife would have hung in better days. That night, she told him about the encounter, mixing gestures with her limited vocabulary of his language. His face darkened as he listened, that warrior stillness settling over him like armor. "Safe," she said in English, then tried the Apache word he'd taught her. "You're safe here." He shook his head slowly, speaking in a mixture of languages she only partially understood. But the meaning was clear. He would not bring danger to her door. He would leave. "No," she said firmly. "No leaving. Not yet." They stared at each other across the flickering firelight, and she saw in his eyes the same loneliness that lived in hers, the same need for connection, for something beyond mere survival. "My mother," he said suddenly in careful English. "Soldiers come. She fight. She—" He made a gesture across his throat that needed no translation. Hannah's heart clenched. She moved without thinking, reaching out to touch his hand where it rested on his knee. He went very still, looking down at her pale fingers against his darker skin. "My people scattered," he continued, the words coming slow but clear. "Some go Mexico. Some surrender. Some fight and die. I fight, but—" He touched his side where the wound still showed pink and tender. "No more fight in me, only tired. Only alone," she finished softly. "I know." Their eyes met and held. The fire crackled between them, sending up sparks that died in the darkness. Outside, a coyote howled, the sound mournful and wild. "Hannah," he said, and in his voice she heard a question, a plea, a promise all rolled into the simple speaking of her name. She squeezed his hand gently, then stood and went to the shelf where she kept her few precious possessions. From behind her Bible, she withdrew a small silver frame containing a photograph, her and Thomas on their wedding day, young and hopeful and ignorant of what lay ahead. She showed it to Taza, pointing to Thomas. "My husband, good man, dead now because people feared what they didn't understand." He studied the photograph with grave attention, then looked back at her. In his dark eyes, she saw understanding, empathy, and something else that made her breath catch. "I won't let that happen again," she said, though whether she meant to him or to herself, she couldn't say. The candle had burned low when he finally spoke again. "Hannah teach Taza shoot arrow. Taza teach Hannah." He paused, searching for words. Then he pointed to his heart, to hers, back to his. "Teach Hannah not alone." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. She felt tears prick her eyes but blinked them back. This strange, quiet man was offering her something she'd thought lost forever, not just companionship, but understanding, connection, the possibility of healing. "Yes," she whispered. Teach me that. He stood then, moving with that fluid grace that marked him as a warrior, even wounded and weaponless. For a moment he hesitated, then bent and pressed his lips to her forehead, a touch light as wind, there and gone before she could react. Sleep now, he said softly. Tomorrow, more teaching. She sat by the dying fire long after he'd retired, her fingers touching the spot where his lips had brushed her skin. Outside, clouds gathered over the mountains, promising rain by morning. Change was coming, whether they willed it or not. But tonight, in this small circle of light carved from the vast darkness, she felt less alone than she had in years. Tomorrow would bring its challenges. Morrison's suspicions, the town's fears, the impossibility of what was growing between them. Tonight, though, she had this, the memory of laughter over missed arrows, the warmth of understanding in dark eyes, the promise that loneliness need not be forever. It was enough. For now, it was everything. The attack came 3 nights later, swift and brutal as a rattlesnake's strike. Hannah woke to the crash of breaking glass and rough hands dragging her from bed. She fought instinctively, fingernails raking across stubbled flesh. But there were 2 of them, and they were ready for resistance. Where is he? The voice belonged to Jack Curry, a drifter who'd been hanging around town for the past month. His breath reeked of whiskey and malice. Where's the Apache? I don't know what you're... The slap snapped her head sideways, filling her mouth with the copper taste of blood. Don't lie to me. Woman. Morrison saw the tracks, fresh moccasin prints all around your property. His partner, a wiry man she didn't recognize, was already tearing through her belongings, so upending drawers and scattering the contents. Found Indian sign, all right, he called out. Arrows, beadwork. She's been hiding him, sure enough. Hannah's heart hammered as she heard them moving through the cabin. Taza had been sleeping in the barn for the past week, insisting it was safer. Had he heard the commotion? Had he fled? Please, she said, forcing calm into her voice. There's no one here but me. Those things belong to my husband. He collected... Curry's hand tangled in her hair, yanking her head back. Your husband's dead, and everybody knows he was a traitor. Guess it runs in the family, spreading your legs for savages. The crude words sent fury through her fear. Get out of my house. He laughed, an ugly sound. Oh, we'll leave. Right after we collect that bounty. $500 for Apache scalps. Your boy's gonna make us rich. The barn door crashed open. Hannah's blood turned to ice as she heard sounds of struggle. A cry of pain. They dragged Taza in moments later, blood streaming from a gash above his eye. He'd fought, she could see it in Curry's torn shirt and his partner's swelling jaw, but he was still weak from his wounds. And they'd had surprise on their side. Well, Curry said, releasing Hannah to study their captive. Bit scrawny for an Apache brave, ain't he? Still, hair's long enough, scalp'll spend just as good. Taza's eyes found Hannah's across the room. She saw no fear there, only concern for her. Even now, facing death, he was worried about her. He's done nothing wrong, Hannah said desperately. He was wounded, dying. I couldn't just... Save your breath. The wiry man cut her off. We know what you were doing with him. Probably got a half-breed brat in your belly already. The insinuation was too much. Hannah lunged for the kitchen drawer where Thomas's pistol lay. But Curry was faster. He caught her wrist, twisting until she cried out and dropped to her knees. Feisty one, ain't she? He looked at his partner with an expression that made Hannah's skin crawl. Maybe after we're done with the Apache, we'll teach her what happens to Indian lovers. Make sure she learns her lesson real good. Taza made a sound low in his throat. Not quite a growl, but something equally primal. Despite the rope binding his hands, despite the blood in his eyes, he looked dangerous in that moment, deadly. Easy there, Chief, Curry said, drawing his knife. Your turn's coming, but first, I think the lady needs to understand her position. He grabbed the front of Hannah's nightgown, and she knew with sick certainty what was coming. She'd heard stories from other women. whispered tales of what men did when law and decency were absent. Her body tensed, preparing to fight even though she knew it was hopeless. The gunshot was impossibly loud in the small cabin. Curry's expression went slack with surprise. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest, then toppled backward like a felled tree. His partner spun toward the door, reaching for his weapon, but Taza was already moving. Bound hands or no. He drove his shoulder into the man's midsection, slamming him into the wall with bone-cracking force. Sheriff Morrison stood in the doorway, smoking rifle in hand. His face was grim as he surveyed the scene. Curry dead on the floor, his partner groaning against the wall. Hannah huddled in torn nightclothes, and Taza standing protective over her despite his bonds. "Heard these boys talking in the saloon," Morrison said slowly. "Bragging about what they were planning. Didn't sit right with me." He moved into the room, keeping his rifle trained on Curry's partner. "You all right, Mrs. Whitmore?" Hannah found her voice with effort. "Yes, they didn't have time to—" "Good." Morrison's eyes moved to Taza, and something complex passed over his features. "This the Apache Tom Bradley's been squawking about?" She lifted her chin. "This is the man who's been helping me with the heavy work, nothing more." "That's so?" Morrison studied Taza for a long moment, taking in the defensive stance, the protective positioning, the way his dark eyes never left Hannah. "Funny thing, I knew Thomas Whitmore. Good man. Shame what happened to him." "Yes," Hannah said quietly. "It was. Man shouldn't die for his principles, even if they're unpopular." Morrison's gaze was steady on hers. "And a woman shouldn't suffer for showing Christian charity to the wounded." He moved to Curry's partner, hauling him roughly to his feet. The man groaned, clutching his ribs. "Here's what's going to happen," Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of law. "This piece of trash is going to jail for assault and attempted murder. Curry's going to the undertaker. And you, Mrs. Whitmore, are going to tell me that this man," he gestured to Taza with his rifle, "is your hired hand, been working for you for, let's say, a month, has papers and everything." Hannah blinked in surprise. Yes, that's right." "Good. I'll need to see those papers, of course. Tomorrow will be fine. Gives you time to find them." The slight emphasis on find wasn't lost on her. "As for you," he addressed Taza directly. "You speak English?" "Some," Taza said carefully. "Then understand this. I don't care if you're Apache, Mexican, or from the moon itself. You work hard, stay out of trouble, and treat Mrs. Whitmore with respect. We won't have problems. But if I hear even a whisper that you've brought danger to this woman's door, I'll hang you myself. Clear?" Taza nodded once, sharply. Morrison hauled his prisoner toward the door, then paused. "Lock this behind me. And Mrs. Whitmore, might be best if your hired hand sleeps in the house for a while, for security purposes." Then he was gone, leaving them alone with Curry's cooling corpse and the weight of what had almost happened. Hannah began to shake, the reality of how close she'd come to. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold in the tremors. Taza was beside her instantly, his bound hands making his movements awkward. He spoke urgently in his own language, then switched to English. "Hannah, safe now. Safe." She looked up at him through tears she hadn't realized were falling. "They would have killed you. Would have." "Shh." He sank to his knees beside her chair, leaning his forehead against her arm since he couldn't hold her properly. "Not happen. You safe." She reached for the knife Curry had dropped, cutting through the rope binding his wrists. The moment he was free, he gathered her against him, one hand cradling her head while the other stroked her back in soothing patterns. They stayed that way for a long time, holding each other among the wreckage of her once safe home. She breathed in his scent, felt the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. Alive. They were both alive. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered against his chest. His arms tightened around her. "Not leave. Promise, not leave Hannah alone." The words broke something inside her. She pulled back just far enough to see his face, one hand reaching up to touch the cut above his eye. He caught her hand, pressing it against his cheek. "Taza," she breathed. "Hannah," he answered, and then his mouth was on hers. The kiss was desperate, hungry, filled with all the fear and relief and need of the night. She tasted blood from her split lip, salt from her tears. But beneath it all was him, wild and warm and absolutely present. His hands tangled in her hair, holding her as if she might disappear. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she saw her own wonder reflected in his eyes. She started, then stopped, not sure what to say. He touched her face gently, thumb brushing away a tear. "Tomorrow, we think. Tonight?" He looked meaningfully at Curry's body. "Tonight we clean, make safe again." She nodded, practical needs reasserting themselves. They worked together in grim efficiency, wrapping the body in old canvas, mopping blood from the floorboards, setting the cabin to rights. By dawn, only the bullet hole in the floor remained as evidence of the night's violence. As the sun rose, painting the desert in soft pastels, Hannah made coffee while Taza repaired the broken window. They moved around each other with new awareness, hands brushing as they passed, eyes meeting and holding before shyly looking away. "Morrison was right," she said finally. "You should stay in the house." He paused in his work. "Hannah's sure." She thought of the kiss, of what it meant, what it might lead to. Thought of the danger, the impossibility of it all, then thought of facing another night alone, jumping at every sound, wondering if more men like Curry would come calling. "I'm sure," she said softly. "Please stay." He set down his tools and came to her, cupping her face in his calloused hands. "Stay," he agreed. "Keep safe, keep." He searched for words, then gave up, kissing her forehead instead. They were crossing a line. She knew. After tonight, there would be no pretending he was merely hired help, no maintaining the polite fiction for the town's benefit. But as she looked into his dark eyes, saw the fierce protectiveness there mixed with something softer, something that might be love, she found she didn't care. Let them talk. Let them judge. She'd already lost everything once to other people's ideas of right and wrong. She wouldn't lose this, whatever this was, to fear. "Together," she said, and felt him relax against her. "Together." He agreed, and sealed it with another kiss. The week that followed was like something from a dream, too perfect to be real, yet too vivid to be anything else. They fell into a new rhythm, different from the careful dance of patient and caretaker, different even from the tentative friendship that had grown between them. Now there were stolen kisses in the morning sunlight, lingering touches as they worked side by side, quiet evenings where words were unnecessary. Hannah taught Taza to read from her small collection of books, his quick mind grasping the letters with surprising speed. He taught her more of his language, laughing, really laughing now, when she mangled the pronunciation of particularly difficult words. They went fishing at the stream where she'd found him. The place that had brought them together transformed from a sight of near death to one of simple contentment. "My people have story," Taza told her one evening as they cleaned their catch. "About woman who save warrior from river. He promised to bring her the moon. She say, 'Keep your moon. Bring me your heart instead.'" "And did he?" Hannah asked, smiling at the tale. "Every night for rest of his days." Taza replied, his eyes warm on hers. They made love for the first time as a thunderstorm rolled across the desert, the cabin lit by flashes of lightning. Hannah had been frightened of storms since childhood, but wrapped in Taza's arms, she felt only safe. He was gentle, patient, treating her body with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes. When thunder shook the walls, he held her closer, whispering Apache words that sounded like prayers. Afterward, they lay entwined, listening to the rain drum against the roof. Hannah traced the scars on his chest, so many of them, each telling a story of violence survived. "No more," she whispered, pressing her lips to a particularly savage mark. No more fighting. No more blood. He caught her hand, holding it against his heart. No more, he agreed. Only this, only Hannah. But even in their private paradise, the outside world intruded. Sheriff Morrison visited twice, bringing the promised papers that established Taza as a legitimate hired hand. The documents were obvious forgeries, but they would pass casual inspection. There's talk in town, Morrison warned on his second visit. That drifter who survived is spinning tales to anyone who'll listen. Most folks aren't buying it. Everyone knew Curry was trash. But some are listening. Let them talk, Hannah said, chin high. Morrison studied them both, the way they stood close but not touching, the careful distance they maintained in his presence. Just be careful, both of you. The world isn't ready for whatever this is. After he left, Taza was quiet, withdrawn in a way he hadn't been since those first days. Hannah found him later standing at the window, staring out at the vast desert. You could go, she said softly. Head to Mexico, start fresh where no one knows you. He turned to her, and the look in his eyes made her heart clench. Hannah, want this? No, she admitted. But I want you safe more than I want you here. He crossed to her in 2 strides, pulling her against him. Where Hannah is, there Taza is safe. Only place in world. They made love with desperate urgency that night, as if trying to hold back the dawn through sheer force of will. But morning came anyway, and with it, the sound of approaching horses. Not Morrison this time. 3 riders, moving fast. Taza was already reaching for the rifle when they recognized the lead rider, Tom Bradley, the man who'd first spotted signs of Taza's presence. Mrs. Whitmore, Bradley called out, not bothering to dismount. Thought you should know. Army patrol heading this way, looking for Apache renegades who hit a supply wagon last week. Hannah's blood chilled. Taza hasn't left the property and don't matter, Bradley interrupted. They find an Apache here. They won't ask questions, just shoot or arrest. He paused, something almost like sympathy crossing his weathered features. My brother died hard at Apache hands, it's true. But from what Morrison says, your man here ain't that kind. Might be you should make yourself scarce for a while. The riders wheeled and galloped off, leaving dust and dread in their wake. How long? Hannah asked, though she dreaded the answer. Taza was already gathering essentials. Weapons, food, water. Must go now. Soldiers move fast. She corrected. We must go now. He stopped, staring at her. Hannah cannot what? Cannot leave my home? Cannot survive in the wild? Cannot choose you over everything else? She was already pulling on her riding clothes. I've lost one man I love to ignorance and fear. I won't lose another. The desert is hard, dangerous. So is being alone, she countered. I've done that. I choose the desert. He caught her face in his hands, searching her eyes. Whatever he saw there must have convinced him, because he nodded once, sharply. Pack light, move fast, trust Taza. They worked with swift efficiency, taking only what they could carry on horseback. Hannah paused just once, picking up the photograph of her and Thomas. After a moment's hesitation, she left it on the mantel. That life was over. Had been over the moment she'd chosen to save a wounded Apache by a stream. They rode out as dust clouds appeared on the eastern horizon. The cavalry. Still miles away, but closing. Taza led them into the maze of canyons and arroyos he'd scouted during his recovery. Paths invisible to those who didn't know the land's secrets. They rode through the heat of the day, stopping only to water the horses at hidden springs Taza knew. Hannah had thought herself hardened to the desert's ways, but this was different. This was the deep desert, the wild places where only Apache and desperados ventured. As the sun began to sink, they made camp in a sheltered canyon. No fire, the smoke would betray them. They ate cold biscuits and dried meat, washing it down with warm water that tasted of leather and freedom. Regret? Taza asked as purple twilight painted the canyon walls. Hannah looked around at the alien landscape, then at the man beside her. His face was painted with dust and sweat, his clothes already showing wear from their flight. But his eyes were warm on hers, full of concern and love and promise. "No regret," she said firmly. "Never." They made a bed of blankets beneath the stars, the desert floor still warm from the day's heat. When Taza reached for her, she went willingly, needfully. Their lovemaking was different here, primal, urgent, touched with the danger of their flight. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, aware that sound carried far in the desert night. Afterward, they lay watching the stars wheel overhead, more stars than she'd ever seen from her cabin window. Taza pointed out the patterns his people saw, not the Greek heroes of her childhood lessons, but Apache warriors and sacred animals living forever in the night sky. "Where are we going?" she asked eventually. "South, Mexico. Maybe, or west to where my mother's people live. Places where Apache and white woman can just be man and wife." Man and wife. The words sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cooling air. Was that what they were now? What they could be? "Tell me," she said. "Tell me about your family. Your real name. Everything I don't know." So he did, his voice low and musical in the darkness. His full name was Taza Redhawk, given for the bird that had circled overhead at his birth. His father had been a war chief, his mother a Mexican captive who'd chosen to stay with the tribe after falling in love. He told her about growing up wild and free, about the coming of the whites and the slow destruction of his people's way of life. "Tried to walk both paths," he said. "Learn white ways, keep Apache heart. But men like Curry, like the soldiers, they see only the Apache, the enemy." "Not everyone," Hannah said, thinking of Morrison, of Bradley's unexpected warning. "There's good in people, even in dark times." Hannah is proof. Taza agreed, pulling her closer. Light in darkness, hope where was none. They slept fitfully, aware of pursuit, of danger. But when Hannah woke in the pre-dawn hour, Taza's arms around her in the vast desert stretching endlessly before them, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: freedom. They had little money, fewer supplies, and no clear destination beyond away. They were pursued by the army, fleeing into hostile territory with only Taza's knowledge and their mutual trust to guide them, by any reasonable measure. Their situation was desperate. But as the first light of dawn painted the canyon walls gold and rose, as Taza stirred beside her and pressed a sleepy kiss to her temple, Hannah found herself smiling. She'd traded safety for uncertainty, respectability for love, the known for the unknown. It was the best bargain she'd ever made. "Ready?" Taza asked as they prepared to ride. She swung up into the saddle, muscles already protesting yesterday's hard riding. There would be more today, and tomorrow, and for who knew how many days after, but at the end of that trail lay possibility, a place where they could simply be Taza and Hannah, not Apache and white woman, not scandal and shame. "Ready," she said, and meant it. They rode into the rising sun, two small figures against the vastness of the desert, carrying nothing but hope and each other. Behind them, dust and pursuit. Ahead, the unknown. Together. The news reached them in a Mexican cantina, 3 weeks into their flight. Hannah had gone to buy provisions while Taza waited with the horses, even this far south. An Apache face drew suspicion. She was practicing her broken Spanish with the shopkeeper's wife when she heard English voices from the cantina next door. "Hung him at Fort Grant last week. Apache what killed them 2 bounty hunters up near the border." Hannah's blood turned to ice. She forced herself to continue examining the dried beans, though her hands trembled. "Heard tell he was hiding with some white woman. Widow, they say. She's wanted for questioning now." "Questioning," another voice snorted. "That's a polite way of saying they'll hang her too if they catch her. Traitor's justice." She paid quickly and left, fighting the urge to run. Taza read the truth in her face before she spoke. "They're saying you killed those men," she whispered once they were away from town. "That you've been hanged." His face went still, processing this. "Good. They stopped looking." "No, you don't understand." She gripped his arm. "They hanged someone else. Another Apache. For crimes you didn't commit. The pain that flashed across his features was quickly hidden. But she'd seen it. Another of his people dead for white men's justice. Another ghost to carry. We go back, she said suddenly. Tell them the truth. Morrison knows. Morrison cannot stop army. Cannot bring dead back to life. Taza's voice was gentle but firm. We go back. We both die. That Apache's death means nothing. You understand? She wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. The world they'd fled didn't care about truth, only about maintaining order through fear. Going back would only add their bodies to the count. They rode in heavy silence until they reached their hidden camp in the hills. Only when they were safely concealed did Taza allow his mask to slip. He sat staring into the small fire, shoulders bowed with a weight she recognized. Survivor's guilt. What was the name of the warrior who died? Hannah asked softly. Taza looked up, surprised. Not know. Why does Hannah ask? Because he should be remembered. Not as a criminal, but as a man who died so others might live. She moved to sit beside him. In my church, we called that sacrifice, the greatest love. Apache have different word, Taza said after a moment. But meaning same. Warrior who dies for tribe lives forever in spirit world. They held a small ceremony that night, Taza singing prayers in his language while Hannah read from her Bible. Two traditions meeting in respect for the unnamed dead. When they finished, some of the tension had eased from Taza's features, but their problems were far from over. The false news of Taza's execution had unexpected consequences, with the Apache killer supposedly dead. The army's search lost urgency, but bounty hunters and glory seekers flooded the borderlands, hoping to find the white woman who'd harbored him. Hannah couldn't show her face in any settlement without risking recognition. Their money ran low, then out entirely. Taza hunted when he could, but game was scarce in the drought-stricken land. They ate mesquite beans and prickly pear, drank from springs that barely produced enough water to wet their throats. Worst of all, Hannah had begun to feel strange. Dizzy spells came without warning. Food, when they had it, often came back up. She tried to hide it, but Taza's watchful eyes missed nothing. You sick, he said one morning after she'd stumbled to the bushes to retch. Need medicine. Need doctor. I'm fine, she insisted, though they both knew it was a lie. Just tired, the heat, but she knew what was wrong. Had known for weeks, probably, but refused to acknowledge it. The missed monthly courses, the tender breasts, the bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with their hard traveling. Thomas had gotten her with child twice before, though neither baby had lived past birthing. She recognized the signs. There's something I need to tell you, she began that evening, but the sound of horses cut her off. 3 riders, moving fast up the canyon toward their camp. Taza was already moving, rifle in hand, pushing her toward the rocks. But these weren't soldiers or bounty hunters. Taza Redhawk, the lead rider called out in accented English. I seek Taza Redhawk. Taza stepped out cautiously, rifle still ready. The riders were Apache, 2 men and a woman, travel-worn but well-armed. I am Taza, he said in Apache, then continued in that language. Hannah caught only fragments, but she understood enough. These were survivors from his band, led by his cousin, Grey Wolf. The reunion was subdued but emotional. Warriors who'd thought each other dead embracing briefly, exchanging news in rapid Apache. The woman, introduced as Maria, Grey Wolf's wife, came to sit with Hannah, studying her with intelligent dark eyes. You are the one who saved him, Maria said in careful English. Grey Wolf did not believe when we heard the stories. Said Taza would never take a white woman. Things change, Hannah said simply. Maria's eyes dropped to Hannah's waist, a knowing look crossing her features. Yes, many things change. The discussion between the men grew heated. Grey Wolf kept gesturing south, toward Mexico, his voice urgent. Taza's responses were firm but conflicted. Finally, he came to Hannah. My cousin brings news. There is a Apache band in Sierra Madre. Safe place, hidden. They welcome us. He paused, searching her face. But his hard journey, very hard. And And I'm white, Hannah finished. They'll welcome you, not me. I make them understand, Taza said fiercely. You are my woman, my... He said something in Apache that made Grey Wolf snort and Maria smile slightly. Your what? Hannah asked. Is no word in English. Means heartkeeper, soul guard, the one who holds warrior's spirit when body walks earth. Despite everything. Hannah felt tears prick her eyes. Taza. But must tell truth. He continued. Journey is dangerous. 2 weeks through desert and mountain, little water, less food, and Hannah is... His eyes dropped to her belly. So he had noticed. Of course he had. With child, she confirmed quietly. Your child. The joy that transformed his face was quickly replaced by worry. Then cannot go. Too dangerous. Must find safe place. Doctor, proper food. Where? Hannah interrupted. Where is safe for us? For our child? She gestured to their mean camp, their dwindling supplies. At least with your people. We'd have community, protection, a chance. Grey Wolf said something sharp in Apache. Taza responded sharply, and for a moment Hannah thought they might come to blows. Then Grey Wolf looked at Hannah, really looked at her, taking in her travel-worn clothes, her sun-darkened skin, the steel in her spine. You keep up, you come, he said in English. You fall behind, we leave you. This is Apache way. I'll keep up, Hannah said firmly. They left at first light, 5 riders moving like ghosts through the desert. Maria rode beside Hannah, occasionally offering advice about the terrain or sharing dried meat from her pack. The men ranged ahead and behind, watching for pursuit. The first week tested Hannah in ways she hadn't imagined. They rode from before dawn until after dark, stopping only when the horses absolutely required rest. Water was rationed to mouthfuls. Food was whatever they could catch or gather. Lizards, snakes, desert plants that tasted of bitterness and survival. Hannah's pregnancy made everything harder. The constant motion brought waves of nausea. The scant food was often impossible to keep down. But she kept silent, kept riding, kept placing one foot in front of the other when they had to walk the horses through rough terrain. On the 8th day, she collapsed. She came to with Taza's arms around her, his voice urgent in her ear. They'd made camp early. She realized, because of her. Cannot go on, Grey Wolf was saying. She dying, slow us all down, then I stay with her. Taza replied flatly. And I? For white woman. For my woman, my child. Maria intervened, her voice sharp. Hannah didn't understand the words, but the tone was universal. A woman telling men to stop being fools. She came to Hannah with a water skin and something wrapped in cloth. Eat, she commanded. Is medicine. Apache women use when carrying children on hard journeys. The herbs were bitter, but Hannah forced them down. Within an hour, the worst of the nausea had passed. She struggled to her feet, meeting Grey Wolf's skeptical gaze. I said I'd keep up. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or the beginning of respect. 4 more days to mountains. Then we see. They pushed on, climbing from desert into foothills, from foothills into true mountains. The air grew cooler, water more plentiful. Pine trees appeared, then aspens, their leaves whispering of home and safety. On the 12th day, they created a rise, and Hannah saw it, an Apache camp nestled in a hidden valley, smoke rising from cook fires, children playing between wickiups, dogs barking welcome. Is this real? She whispered. Taza's arm came around her waist, supporting her swaying form. Real, safe, home. The summer sun painted the desert in shimmering waves of gold as Hannah stood at the edge of their small homestead, her son balanced on her hip, at 4 years old. Samuel had his father's dark eyes and strong features, but his hair held hints of his mother's lighter brown, marking him as a child of 2 worlds. Papa coming! Samuel pointed excitedly at the dust trail approaching from town. Hannah's heart lifted as she recognized Taza's familiar form on horseback, returning from the market where he sold the furniture and tools he crafted. The years had been kind to them here, in this small valley 20 miles from any town. Far enough for privacy, but close enough for trade. Yes, sweet boy. Papa's home. They'd returned from Mexico 2 years ago, when word came that the territory had passed new laws, partly thanks to Sheriff Morrison's unexpected advocacy. Apache who could prove peaceful intent and steady employment could claim homestead rights. It wasn't perfect, wasn't equal, but it was enough. The cabin Taza had built was modest but solid, with real glass windows and a wooden floor. Luxuries Hannah had once taken for granted, now treasured all the more for having lived without them. Their garden flourished under her care, and Taza's skill with woodworking brought in enough money for necessities and a bit extra. "My family," Taza called out as he dismounted, catching Samuel as the boy launched himself into his father's arms. The English came easier now, though he still favored Apache when teaching their son the old stories. "Welcome home," Hannah said, rising on her toes to kiss him. Even now, after all they'd been through, that simple gesture of affection in daylight felt like a small rebellion. "Good trading?" she asked as they walked to the cabin together. "Very good. Sold all pieces, and—" He produced a letter from his shirt, his expression unreadable. "This come for you." Hannah's blood chilled. Letters rarely brought good news. But when she saw the handwriting, she gasped. "It's from Mary, my sister in Ohio. I wrote her last year but never thought—" She tore it open with trembling hands, scanning the contents. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she read. "Hannah?" Taza's voice was concerned. "Is bad news?" "No." She laughed through her tears. "No, she wants to visit. Says she doesn't care what the family thinks. She misses me and wants to meet you and Samuel." Taza set Samuel down, taking Hannah's face in his hands. "This makes you happy?" "So happy," she whispered. "I thought I'd lost everyone." But the letter wasn't the day's only surprise. As they approached the cabin, Hannah noticed horses tied at the rail, 3 of them, with military saddles. Taza's hand went to his rifle, but Hannah caught his arm. "Wait." The door opened, and Sheriff Morrison stepped out, older now, his hair more silver than brown. With him were 2 Army officers Hannah didn't recognize. "Mrs. Whitmore." Morrison nodded. Or should I say Mrs. Redhawk. Never did get the paperwork straight on that. "Sheriff," Hannah said carefully, "what brings you here?" "These gentlemen," Morrison indicated the officers, "are from Fort Grant. Seems they have a proposition for your husband." The senior officer, a Captain Hayes, stepped forward. "Mr. Redhawk, I'll be direct. The Army needs scouts who know this territory, who can help keep peace between settlers and the Apache bands still in the mountains. Men who understand both worlds." Taza's expression was stone. "Army wants Apache to hunt Apache? Army wants to prevent bloodshed." Hayes corrected. "On both sides, too many young hotheads, white and Apache alike, eager to fight. We need voices of reason, men who've proven they can walk between worlds. The pay is good," Morrison added, "and it comes with official recognition. Protection under law for you and your family." Hannah felt Taza tense beside her. She knew what he was thinking, of betrayal, of being asked to turn against his people. But she also knew him well enough to hear what wasn't being said. "You want him to help make peace," she said. "Real peace, not just surrender." Captain Hayes studied her with sharp eyes. "You understand correctly, ma'am. The wars are ending, one way or another. How they end, that's what we're trying to influence." They talked long into the evening, the officers explaining their vision of Apache scouts, helping to mediate disputes, to find missing settlers and warriors alike, to build understanding where now there was only fear. "I need time," Taza said finally. "Must think, speak with elders." "Fair enough." Hayes stood. "We'll be at Fort Grant for another month. Send word when you decide." After they left, Hannah and Taza sat on the porch, watching Samuel chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "What does your heart say?" Hannah asked softly. "Is hard. Some will call me traitor. Apple, red outside, white inside." He was quiet for a moment. "But maybe Maybe as chance to save lives, to help young ones find different path than only war. "You're not a traitor," Hannah said firmly. "You're a bridge. Our son is proof that bridges are possible." Taza pulled her close, pressing his lips to her hair. "Wise woman? How did Apache warrior get so lucky?" "Clean living," she said with a straight face, making him laugh. 2 weeks later, Taza sent word to Fort Grant. He would scout, but on conditions: fair treatment of Apache prisoners, respect for sacred sites, and Hannah's inclusion in any meetings involving women and children. Hayes agreed to all terms. The work was dangerous. Taza spent weeks away, tracking renegades, negotiating with hostile bands, sometimes barely escaping with his life. But slowly, carefully, he built trust. Young warriors listened when he spoke of different futures. Settlers learned that not every Apache was an enemy. Hannah, meanwhile, found her own role. She established a small school, teaching Apache and Mexican children alongside the few white settlers' kids who came. She served as informal translator and mediator when Apache women came to town for supplies. Her garden became famous for medicinal herbs that drew people of all backgrounds. Not everyone approved. They received threats, found their fences cut, their water diverted. But for every enemy, they found unexpected allies. The Methodist minister who preached tolerance from his pulpit, the Mexican rancher who hired Apache cowboys, the Jewish merchant who extended credit without prejudice. One evening, as autumn painted the mountains crimson and gold, they hosted an unusual gathering. Sheriff Morrison was there, along with Grey Wolf and Maria visiting from Mexico. Hannah's sister Mary had arrived the week before, her initial shock giving way to warm acceptance. Even Captain Hayes attended, bringing his wife, who peppered Hannah with questions about desert gardening. They ate Hannah's stew and Taza's hunted venison, drank coffee and tiswin in careful moderation. Samuel played with Grey Wolf's children, their laughter transcending any language. As the sun set, Taza told stories in the old way, his voice carrying across the desert air while Hannah translated for those who needed it. "Look at this," Morrison said quietly to Hannah as Taza demonstrated a traditional dance for the children. 15 years ago, this would have been impossible. Maybe there's hope for this territory yet. "There's always hope," Hannah replied, her hand resting on her belly where their second child grew. "Sometimes it just takes people willing to reach across the divide." Later, as their guests departed and Samuel slept, Hannah and Taza stood together watching the stars. An eagle called from the cliffs, its cry echoing across the valley. "The fire you thought was gone," Hannah said softly, remembering his words from so long ago. "Do you still feel it?" Taza turned her to face him, his eyes bright with emotion. "Fire burns different now. Not for war, for this." He gestured to their home, their land, their life together. For future, for children who will know both worlds and make them one. For love. Hannah added, "Yes," he agreed, pulling her close. "Always for love." In the distance, a coyote howled, and another answered. The desert lived and breathed around them. Dangerous still, but no longer hostile. They had carved out a place here, against all odds, against all expectations. It wasn't perfect, might never be perfect, but it was theirs. The fire between them hadn't died. It had transformed, like they had, into something sustainable and warm, something that could light the way for others searching for hope in a divided land. As they went inside, Taza paused at the door, looking back at the vast star-filled sky. He whispered something in Apache, a prayer of gratitude. Hannah had learned enough to know. She added her own silent thanks, for second chances, for unexpected love, for the courage to choose each other when the whole world said no, for the fire that refused to die. Thank you for listening to this tale from the Wild West. If you enjoyed this story of love conquering the harsh divides of the frontier, please let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We'd love to connect with fellow Western romance enthusiasts around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more tales of courage, passion, and redemption in the American frontier. Share your thoughts below. What touched your heart in Taza and Hannah's journey?